like what OK conduct is and what OK conduct isn't, then the problem becomes more difficult. Like we saw this with EOS, for example, right? Like with EOS, I mean, like the whole thing quickly collapsed into people bribing each other to vote for each other and like creating this sort of plutocratic cartel where you have a fairly small number of people just like help vote for each other and like pay each other to be block producers. And at the beginning, like I saw a lot of people arguing that like, hey, like bribing people, like buying people's votes is not illegitimate behavior, like because like isn't this the free market and aren't we about building a free market system? And like when you have a system where like people don't even like this kind of layer of shared moral expectations isn't even there at the beginning, then you're relying on kind of just the raw economics in a much more stronger way than you normally are, and so the problem is more difficult. So like in some ways I'm happy that kind of the simpler cases are being tried first, and then we can kind of expand the scale more and more over time. I mean, I'm definitely like, one of the reasons I'm not in favor of on-chain governance at all, for example, is because it's basically saying that like, hey, let's make a DAO and let's start with a really big DAO, and oh, by the way, we're going to make the DAO be so systemically important that we give it control of layer one. Like this, like it's basically kind of combining all of the kind of ways of doing irresponsible DAO developments together. Whereas this sort of start small and develop and have lots of little experiments approach, I think, is going to be sort of more fruitful over the long term.
Okay, thank you so much, guys.
We will have an opportunity to take some questions after this, and we'll come to you after that.
Great. Well, hi, everyone. I just wanted to thank ETH Global first for inviting me to have this conversation with Vitalik. This is an honor to be at ETH Waterloo. So yeah, let's get started. So it's been 2 years since the first ETH Waterloo. At the time, crypto was approaching the peak of a bubble, which later burst. Ethereum had really a front row seat in this roller coaster, and it's come a long way since then. First, everyone can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. Okay, so going back to that time in 2017, it seemed like ICOs were probably the main use case for Ethereum. Obviously, regulators came and cracked down on that market. Are you disappointed that happened, or maybe relieved?
I mean, I guess there's like two ways to interpret that question. One is, am I happy that the amount of attention on ICOs has decreased in general? And the other is, am I happy with the way in which the regulatory crackdown proceeded? I'm definitely more positive on the first than the second. So one negative consequence of, say, the way that the regulatory crackdown proceeded, for example, is that it gave people the idea that doing an ICO is not okay, but doing a private sale and launching a VC coin and getting a bunch of rich people in the ground floor, and then doing some work for 1.5 years, and then launching a shitcoin and having retail investors buy the shitcoin at 100x higher valuation is illegal. And so people do the second thing instead of the first, and it's quite possibly even more exploitative. So this is one example of a thing I'm not happy about, but I mean, the facts that kind of ICOs in that particular format in general are much less of a focus now is definitely something that makes me super happy. Basically, I mean, I think, first of all, it's ICOs, the mechanism, are, even though they're theoretically for launching decentralized projects and they're accepting decentralized cryptocurrencies, they're really kind of out of touch with the spirit of what blockchains are about. Because blockchains are, among other things, they're about decentralization and trust minimization. And an ICO basically says, hi, I am a centralized king. You should give me $100 million because you trust me. And I will build this crypto project and I will make it great. So it is, philosophically, it's not kind of aligned at all, right? And you might remember at the beginning of 2018, I released this post like introducing DAICOs. This was this idea that instead of raising into directly into the creator's wallet, you would raise into a smart contract that would release the funds over time. And then more recently, there was this post called on ETH Research called Public Interest Projects, and then there's RDAI, which, as far as I can understand, is basically the same thing. That also does another spin on that, so kind of contribute money over time and use kind of smart contracts instead of contributing money all at once. And I think like trying to use the tools that the crypto space provides us to try to solve like the real like incentive like problems within the crypto space is something that's kind of much more in line with where my own values are. And I'm definitely happy that there's more people kind of thinking about that, and there's less people doing the, hey guys, I'm a centralized king, give me $100 million and trust me sort of thing. And I hope we continue not seeing much of the first and we see more of the second.
Right. Yeah, so maybe the space can mature to realizing crowdfunding is not a bad thing on Ethereum. It just needs to be more aligned with kind of the ethos of the network. Right, and also going back to that time, you were very vocal about how there wasn't much actual value being created to justify the super high valuations. With ETH now below $200, Bitcoin below 10,000, and the whole space at around 240 billion. Do you think that's still the case?
I definitely think that the amount of concrete value produced by the space has really improved a lot over the last 2 years. Like 2 years ago, I think people's expectations were definitely getting far ahead of the reality. And now, like on the one hand, the hype is lower, but on the other hand, the reality is better. And I think that's good on both fronts, and I think we've made a lot of progress, and there's a lot of things that have been and are being built over those last 2 years, like whether we were to talk about scalability improvements, user interface improvements, and of progress toward proof of stake, progress on all of these DeFi fronts, progress on these other applications. And then I think the space is like considerably closer to creating a lot of real value now, and I'm looking forward to when it starts doing that on a much larger scale.
Would you go as far to say that maybe the space or just ETH specifically is undervalued at this point?
No comment.
Boo. Okay. All right. Okay. So. Okay. So obviously, I'll argue that in the past 2 years, much of this value has been created by DeFi, decentralized finance or open finance. It's these group of financial services that are being created on top of Ethereum, and some people have argued that Ethereum would be successful even if it's just kind of a financial chain. What's your view on that? I mean, is DeFi maybe kind of the last wave of Ethereum applications?
I mean, I definitely hope not, because in terms of like what I as a person care about, I would definitely be sad if kind of finance was the end of it. Though, I mean, at the same time, like Ethereum is an ecosystem, and I'm like supposed to be not the dictator. So if it doesn't like perfectly reflect my values, that I'm not supposed to be allowed to complain. But I mean, there's definitely a lot of value that can come out of creating decentralized open financial systems and doing a kind of really good job of making, not just payments, but also like different financial tools like insurance, smart contracts, and kind of this whole suite of things available to the entire world. And it definitely seems like Ethereum's been making a lot of headway there. And I also see why finance has been the kind of initial application that people focus on. Like it's both the one that brings money in the short term, and it's also one where like finance is the one sector where existing centralized solutions are like the most terrible. like sending emails from country to country is trivial, but sending money from country to country is still something that takes a significant amount of effort. Whereas if you just do it over a cryptocurrency, and I give you an address over any of these messengers, and then you send money and it's done, and it's like much simpler. Like I see the value behind the DeFi wave, and I'm happy to see a lot of people building all of these things. And I'm obviously wants to kind of repeat my caveat about like, guys, remember that these smart contracts might have bugs, and guys, remember that half of these things are running with oracles that fall far short of my and probably your standards of what constitutes adequate decentralization, and we need to kind of work harder and keep improving. But kind of assuming that gets solved over time, I definitely think it's great. And going beyond finance, I definitely think there's a lot of other things that blockchains can do. Like I view blockchains more generally as being this kind of economic substrate for mechanism design. And that includes lots of things. It includes incentives, it includes storing information, it includes like keeping track of like public keys, like data that users have published, things like ENS, things like just using Ethereum as an identity layer. I saw there's some recent projects like doing the whole kind of sign in with Ethereum thing, and that's actually something that I think is like it's not like super $50 million glamorous, but it's like the reason I'm interested in it is because like, so first of all, who here has been SIM swapped? A bunch of people, right? And so like a common kind of belief that people have in the back of their minds is that like decentralized systems are generally useful in contexts that require like censorship resistance or like evading powerful governments and these things, because centralized systems are generally more efficient and better for normal people's use cases. But in reality, the whole cell phone SIM swapping thing and just generally identity is like a great example of why that's not the case. So like basically, you know, just any rando can go and just socially engineer one of these telephone companies and get them to just turn over control of your account and anything that and we started like over the last 10 years have creeped into using phone numbers as a centralized identity system. And so if you capture someone's cell phone, then you capture their identity. You can capture pretty much any online accounts where they use their phone number as a backup, and it's like all very terrible. And so here's the I just want to finish the case for decentralizing the thing, right? So another one of the things that I've been like actively pushing for, I've like said this at pretty much every conference, is smart contract wallets. So things like social key recovery, multi-sigs, like going beyond kind of one key being the thing that defines your ownership of assets. And my theory is that like these kinds of techniques have to exist in a decentralized cryptocurrency land, because this is this kind of hostile trial by fire environment where there's huge incentives to steal people's money. There's huge losses if your money gets stolen, huge losses if your money gets lost. And so if we make solutions that are good enough for this environment, then we can also kind of export these solutions and make them useful just as accounts for logging into other things. And now we have kind of crypto-based kind of account management as a base layer, and you start building things on top of that, and now you've started kind of recreating more of the stack on a decentralized base. I've talked for enough.
Okay, so I guess, do you think kind of the next wave of Ethereum innovation or applications will be kind of identity linked to privacy applications?
I don't think there will be one next dominating wave. I think it'll be many waves.
Right. Okay. Okay, and then wanted to touch on something else you mentioned at a conference, which is, you know, this question of whether ETH is money. You said ETH is money if the community wants it to be. So what's your opinion on that? Do you want ETH to be money? And if you do, how good do you think ETH is at being money?
So in Yudkowskian rationalist culture, which is my religion, there are these there is this kind of thing that you're supposed to do, which is kind of tabooing your words, right? So when people have a disagreement about whether or not X is a Y, like like it seems intractable, like try to figure out your disagreement without using the word Y. Right? Because chances are, like a lot of the time what happens is that people don't actually disagree on substance. They just like have different ideas on what this word is. And money is this funny word that lots of people have different meanings for. So like, okay, who here thinks that money and currency are synonyms? Who here thinks that money and currency are not synonyms? Okay, I saw hands raised for both. Like, so we can't even agree on that, right? So, like, clearly the like is ETH money question, like, may very well like not even points to any kind of substantive disagreement of fact. So, like, what can ETH be used for, and can ETH be used for as a way of holding value and sending that value between people? Yes, I mean the Ethereum Foundation has even used ETH that way internally for years. Can ETH be used as a unit of value within smart contracts? Yes. Can ETH be used as a way for paying for transaction fees? Yes. Is ETH something that I recommend as a replacement for US dollars next year or even 10 years from now? Probably no. So like it depends on kind of what your objective is here.
Okay, and then going to another topic, to developer experience. 2 years ago, it was a lot harder to build something on Ethereum over a weekend, like all of these people here are going to do in the next 2 days. How do you think developer experience compares this year with 2017?
I definitely think a lot of things have gotten better. Like first of all, just a lot of the different tools that people have been using have kind of improved more and more over time. On like development environments, like even just the ability to access the blockchain and run a full node efficiently has gotten better. Documentation has gotten better. Compilers have gotten better. Things that you can integrate with. Uniswap now exists and lots of applications plug into Uniswap. ENS is kind of substantially more mature. So formal verification infrastructure is another big one that's made significant strides. Zero knowledge proof infrastructure. So there's definitely a lot of infrastructure that exists now and a lot of things that have gotten easier now that were not there in 2017, and also just kind of knowledge inside people's heads in the community. So, and I definitely think there's been a lot of progress.
So what do you think is missing? Like, what are the big pieces?
What are the big pieces? So this is the sort of question where my answers have been kind of the same for about 5 years, and we have been making a lot of progress though, right? So one is scalability. Transactions are too expensive, and now, we have the new cool thing is rollups apparently, and then of course that's the short-term new cool thing, and the medium-term cool thing is sharding, and those have made huge progress. Another one is just like latency of transactions, and this is just for user experience reasons. Like when I send a transaction, it should be included on chain and get a confirmation within, like ideally, in Bitcoin was like 10 minutes to an hour, then Ethereum got that down to like a couple of minutes. But like block time is 12 seconds, but because of like fee markets weirdness, most of the time people set their fees low and they often have to wait longer. And I'm hoping like EIP 1559 can fix that and get most transactions included in the next block. Proof of stake, just kind of providing more consistent block times. Also with the way that LMD Ghost provides like basically 100 confirmations in parallel. So with ETH 2.0 we get more confirmations sooner. That'll solve some more UX issues. Privacy. I mean, ZK snark-based stuff needs to continue to get better. I think we just need like more incremental improvements on things like proving time, for example, so that signing a transaction or generating a zero knowledge proof can be just a little bit faster. Also, better developer tools for privacy preserving anything. I mean, security and kind of more user-friendly formal verification infrastructure is always good. So. all of those things put together, like it's really kind of a bunch of these incremental slogs where like if we make a lot of progress on each of them, I think we'll do a great job.
Okay, and then speaking of things missing, I think going back to ETH Waterloo 2017, some people back then maybe would have expected that Serenity would have launched by now. What do you say to those critics who, criticize Ethereum for not having launched ETH 2.0 yet, considering, some Bitcoiners use that as an excuse to say ETH is a scam and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like, first of all, yes, like, I definitely was over-optimistic about the timing of ETH2. At the same time, like, the thing I've said is that the properties that ETH2, like, has continue to get better and better. And, like, every time we make an action that looks like, oh, we're going back to the drawing board, like, it's looking, like, every time that happens, it looks less and less drawing boardy. So like the most recent thing, the switch from 1024 shards with cross-linking every epoch to 64 shards with cross-linking every slot, like substantial reorganization of how sharding works, but it doesn't really slow down development. It actually, like, it's a really substantial simplification. It enabled a bunch of things that we thought we would not be able to have before. And we've continued to have all of these improvements of that type. And so the ETH 2.0 final product that it's looking like we'll see is definitely much better than the ETH 2.0 that I was saying 4 years ago we would have 2 years from then. So there's there's the bad, but also the good. And in general, like there's proof of stake has testnets, and we're gonna get to much larger public testnets. We'll get to cross-client testnets. We're gonna get to launch of phase 0, and like at some point, I think the critics are just going to have to kind of face reality, and they're like, "Look, guys, there is a proof of stake chain. It's running, and it's the thing is not a scam." And yeah, and I think it'll definitely make me very happy to see that day. And like, who knows? Maybe 5 years from now, even Bitcoin will be looking at proof of stake a little more favorably.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I don't know if you want to expand more on that. It's a little bit off topic, but yeah, considering kind of, Bitcoin switching to proof of stake, I think it's an interesting notion.
Oh, yes, yeah, I love these. Okay, so, yay, I go into, like, joyful heretic mode. So, I guess, like, the challenge is, right, that, like, there's this kind of looming elephant in the room over, a lot of different cryptocurrencies that kind of committed to a capped issuance schedule. And they, like, really committed to this idea that issuance is evil, and we must have a hard cap, and because a hard cap is the Austrian way, and we must take a strong stance that we are not like those hyperinflationist fiat gold bugs. But the problem is that, like, you need to pay miners for security, and the story has always been, well, we'll use transaction fees for this, right? But if you look at reality, right? So right now, like, I think in Bitcoin, for example, last time I checked, it was about the daily block reward was about $7 million. The daily transaction fees were about 140,000. That's about a factor of 50 difference. In Ethereum, the block reward is about 2 ETH, and the transaction fees are about somewhere between like 0.03 and 0.2 ETH, depending on like which day it is and whether or not some Fairwin or some other crazy application is burning $1 million in fees because of bad mechanics or whatever. But in general, there seems to be this kind of about factor of 50 difference between issuance and fees. And it's not at all clear that fees are going to be able to kind of like, basically it's not at all clear that blockchains are going to continue to be secure when issuance is 50 times lower than, or once the amount going to security providers or miners or stakers is 50 times lower than it is now. And like, I do think that proof of stake does better than proof of work with lower security budgets, but even with proof of stake, like, I'm not confident that like Ethereum proof of stake with 0 issuance is something that it is kind of guaranteed to be able to survive, for example, which is why even past proof of stake, like, we're decreasing the issuance heavily, but there is still some issuance. So I mean, one of the common replies to this, of course, is like, oh, cryptocurrencies are obviously going to be 100 times bigger in 10 years, and that'll cancel things out. But number one, you're not allowed to make crazy, super optimistic assumptions if you're going to argue that about the security of a system that protects people's life savings. And number two, that's not even a correct argument, because if a system gets 50 times bigger, then sure, the security budget becomes 50 times bigger, but the size of the attackers who care about breaking it becomes 50 times bigger. So, like, I think the relative actually matters more than the absolute, and that's an area where kind of the people that focus on the absolute being kind of canceled out by growth of the ecosystem are just wrong. So, like, my view on so like, I think proof of stake is important, and it doesn't even have to be full proof of stake. It could even be hybrid proof of stake. Is a good way of just getting more security with kind of lower, much lower rewards and issuance, which I think is like important, especially for if people kind of value these things like having low issuance or potentially even zero issuance and so forth. But then also, I mean, like my own views on like monetary policy, for example, like this is the question where people ask like, why doesn't Ethereum do a hard cap, or why doesn't Ethereum like commit to a specific schedule, or like something like this. And I remember there was a panel at EdCon in on the opposite side of the world in Sydney 6 months ago, where like this kind of controversial issues panel at the conference, and I asked a bunch of kind of Ethereum community members, do you guys support a hard cap? And the answer I got was universally no. And the reason why is basically because like people seem to kind of appreciate a more kind of pragmatic approach, and one that basically says that like instead of optimizing for predictability of issuance, we're going to optimize for predictability of security, because the platform surviving is the most important thing, and if the platform doesn't survive, we're all screwed anyway. So predictability of security is really important. And the problem is that like we don't know the ratio of security to issuance ahead of time. Like that's just a variable that the real world has, and like we might learn things about it 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. So if we have to choose between like stabilizing issuance and stabilizing security, and we want to stabilize security, that does mean that there's going to be kind of less certainty on issuance than some people would like. But I mean, I think like that's something that like to like a lot of Bitcoin people, for example, is anathema. But like a lot of like Ethereum people I've talked to, I can just seem fine with it.
Really? That's interesting. Okay, so maybe Ethereum will prove to be a good example of proof of stake for Bitcoiners to look at and see how it works. Maybe they'll copy it down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about Bitcoin, to be clear. Like, I hope Litecoin adopts proof of stake as well. I mean, I hope Bitcoin Cash adopts proof of stake. I mean, I hope Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision adopts proof of stake. Like, I mean, I think the thing is a scam, but I think scams running proof of stake is still, like, less environmentally harmful than scams running proof of work. Like, you know, like, harm reduction is supposed to be the mature attitude to have, so, like, whatevs. Yeah.
Okay, and then I think, wrapping up and just looking forward, once Ethereum is running with this better proof of stake and sharding and it's more scalable, what do you think it can achieve in the next decade?
I still think there's a lot of unknowns. And I think, like, I mean, decentralized finance is kind of the lowest risk thing, which is a funny thing to say because the crypto sector as a whole is still kind of much higher risk than some people often give it credit for. But it is like just creating like an open kind of global financial system that people can kind of access to, people can have savings in, people can engage in contracts, get things like insurance, just to get kind of services that are difficult for them to get using kind of traditional centralized tools. I think like even that is, I very much hope that's not the only thing Ethereum does, but even that is something that's kind of very valuable all by itself. But in general, and I think in very vague terms, like the vision is this idea that you can use crypto-economic and decentralized systems to create kind of credibly neutral kind of social institutions and mechanisms. And this can create platforms that kind of more people can trust and more people feel comfortable trusting, can kind of reach across barriers more easily.
You mean like DAOs?
So DAOs are one example of this, right? And like I'm interested in DAOs in the long term. I definitely think that like present day DAO technology, and I agree with Vlad's opinion here that like present day DAOs are not super interesting. What DAOs could be is super interesting. And I really want to see kind of that gap being filled. Like, I think in general, there's this whole branch of kind of economic research into how do we do things like funding public goods, for example. Like I've been a big kind of evangelist for quadratic funding, and people might have seen my recent kind of blog post where I kind of described like Gitcoin's recent quadratic funding round as a way of kind of detecting and funding public goods for the Ethereum ecosystem, in governance of kind of common shared resources, even things like oracles, like all of these problems. Like DAOs are one valuable thing, and financial protocols obviously another valuable thing, and the space of kind of combining together kind of crypto components with kind of internet and social media platforms, I think is kind of an interesting thing. Like, I mean, PPath, for example, like I've talked about a few times. If you look at things like Steemit, for example, like this is something that, I mean, it's like theoretically part of EOS land, so we're kind of theoretically supposed to not consider it legitimate, but like they've done a decent job at like creating this kind of crypto incentivized platform for kind of content generation and at least getting it actively used by like a user base of some size. And I think like the mechanism design can be improved by a lot, but I think like things like that, and trying to kind of solve problems with just present day systems in a lot of cases that kind of incorporate elements of using blockchains as a base layer, incorporate elements of mechanism design, but like mechanism design done well and not just